Welcome to Muslim Apologetics Australia. In this video, we're going to be debunking the Quranist-only Muslims. And of course, this is a new sect that has just emerged recently. And these people have actually been prophesied in the Hadith. The Prophet Muhammad said that one day a group will emerge and they'll actually reject my Sunnah. So that's actually proof and evidence that the Hadith is true and authentic, which prophesizes the behavior of these Quranists who actually appeal to the Quran and reject the Hadith. Now, it's also interesting that the same Quran that we have today was actually handed down to us by those who actually also narrated the Hadith, which is kind of ironic that they would accept the Quran yet reject the Hadith. You know, these people are so absurd that they reject the Hadith. So if they're rejecting the Hadith, they don't even know who the Prophet actually married, how many wives he had, what were their names, their children. There is no biography on the Prophet Muhammad detailing where he actually received the revelation, how he received it, things like how old was he, and so forth. Now, Quranists might look at this and say, oh, it's all irrelevant, but these people believe more about the biography of Alexander the Great than the biography of the Prophet Muhammad. So it's just incredible how they use these incredible double standards and inconsistencies. And this usual hostile approach to the Hadith actually has probably most become by when they can't answer certain questions regarding criticism of Hadith. There may be certain Hadith where they can't respond to, they don't have the knowledge on how to tackle it. So what they do is they basically dismiss it and say, well, it's irrelevant and not important. So then they think that they can then just say, okay, we accept the Quran, and basically that's it. So it's basically a reaction due to not being able to address certain Hadith literature. But let's start. Let's show the most quickest and effective way how to debunk these people claiming that we should only accept the Quran only. Now, it's really interesting. I'll put exactly what the Quran is said, and then I'll give my counter rebuttal. And you will see that when I raise the question, I will get the Quranist to himself testify that you can't even interpret the Quran for face value by itself. And I'll show you how the Quranist himself interjects verses into the Quran to interpret what's in the Quran. So not only does the Quranist not believe that the Quran is the only testimony that we should only take from, I'll make him, in this debate, in this discussion, I'll make him show that external information is relative to the Quran. So it's the Quran is not enough. Even I'll make the Quranist himself admit that by showing him a verse, and you will see in this debate how he interjects his own interpretation into the Quran, and that interpretation doesn't even exist in the Quran. So you'll see that in this debate. So it's very simple. All you need to do is quote him Surah 434. That's it. Zilch. Period. You don't need to go anywhere else. Quote him Surah 434 and then get him to explain Surah 434. Right? So what are the guidelines of interpreting Surah 434 if we're not using the Hadith? You see Christian polemics, they will come up to us and they'll say, oh, Surah 434 teaches to beat women. And of course, the Muslim apologetic position is to explain, no, that's not how we interpret the Quran. We use the Hadith and the Tafsir and when the understandings of the Sahaba who got their explanation from the Prophet Muhammad, because they sat with him, they lived with him, they talked with him, they walked with him, and they basically learned the Quran from him. So the Prophet Muhammad preserved his explanation of the Quran through the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, and they relayed that message onto us. So when we open up a tafsir book or a hadith book, we can actually get in-depth information on the Quranic verses and on Islamic jurisprudence and teachings. That's how it works. And basically, That was my question to the Quranist. I said to him, how do you interpret this verse? Because as Muslims, we need the hadith, and it shows us that this beating of women is actually it's actually symbolic. It's more metaphorical, where you get the muswak and you tap them on the shoulder and so forth, just to convey your anger. It's not a physical punching. But if I was to read Surah 434 for face value without any interpretation or external information, then one could just simply beat their wives uncontrollably. So I raise this question and we'll see what the Quranist actually said in response. And you'll see how he in fact added his own interpretation to the scripture. So I asked the Quranist, I said to him in the comment section, I said to him, so what is the interpretation of this verse? How do you interpret it if you're not using the hadith or the tafsir and so forth? So his name is Bernie Bay. He wrote, strike them out of the house. Look at this. He says, Surah 434 means to not physically hit your wife, but to strike them, meaning push them out of the house and kick them out of the house, basically. And I said to him, what verse? What verse number? He quotes Surah 434. And I said, the word house does not even exist in Surah 434. So notice how you suddenly did not use the Quran only. You added your own words into the Quran. This is why we say the hadith is necessary to interpret Islam. You just proved you could not use the Quran alone, and you interjected a word into the Quran which is not even found. So notice, he rejects the explanation of the hadith and rejects external sources outside the Quran, yet he himself tries to interpret the Quran and tries to use his own opinion upon the Quran, and that opinion is not even stated in the Quran. Now when the Quran is stuck and he can't respond to that because he just got cornered, got clearly debunked and shown hypocrisy on his side, what is the next tactic they use? They say, oh, look, we can't now use our opinion. We can't now put that into that because that would just make it like a hadith, right? So then what they do is, when they get cornered and refuted, they then use another Quranic verse to justify and interpret Surah 434. So they'll bring things like Surah 2190, which says, do not transgress. God does not like the aggressors. God commands husbands and wives to treat each other with love and mercy. And he quotes Surah 30:21, and then they'll go to Surah 4, which, and of course he just speaks about how you should treat your wives nicely. So that is not really an answer. Yes, in general sense, we are to treat them with goodness. This doesn't mean they don't get striked when they cross the line as a disciplinary measure. And Surah 434 outlines that as a form of discipline. So when the Quran says you should treat them nicely in many different passages, that is in the context of if they treat you good and they treat you respectfully, obviously you'll show that mutual respect back. So the Quranist again fails in his attempt to show other verses of mercy to try and somehow abrogate Surah 434. No, that doesn't work that way. And again, folks, I don't want you to get misled, or non-Muslims listening to this conversation. I'm basically showing the Quranist that you need the hadith to actually truly interpret Surah 434, which actually shows it more symbolic than it is. But if you're going to use the Quran itself, it's not going to work. If you're going to try and use your own opinion, then you can't call yourself a Quranist because you reject hadith, you tell us to accept your opinion. Now, he got so refuted on this point that he basically started saying things like, when has beating a woman for transgression stopped any of them for cheating? So now he's actually arguing with the Quran, saying that this is basically nonsense, that the Quran would say this. And I said to him, maybe you should ask Allah that question, not me. So notice now he's left debating me, he's now arguing with Allah. He goes, and then he writes, come to America with that attitude, a restraining order. So what? You're going to put a restraining order on the Quran now? No, you don't need to do that. Maybe you need to now leave the Quran, or I'll give you a better alternative. That is to use sources outside the Quran to explain the conduct of beating. Now you're accusing the Quran needs restraining. Interesting how now the Quranist himself is turning against Surah 434. Possibly, who knows, he'll probably say that verse has been interpolated or fabricated or made up. I don't know. I mean, look where this guy's heading. Now notice, he used the attempt of trying to put his own opinion onto the Quran. He got caught out on that, on hypocrisy. He then tried to use other verses of the Quran to explain Surah 434, and that didn't work. Now he uses the third tactic, and that is what all Quranists usually use. And they would use a verse in the Quran which says that the Quran is a complete book and is fully detailed. This is a third attempt. But this can be easily addressed and debunked. The term fully detailed means in what is necessary, and fully detailed means to accept that it has a separate source explanation. How do we know this? Because Surah 16:44 narrates this. It says, and I quote, "With clear signs and books we sent the messenger, and we have also sent down Muhammad, the reminder and the advice, the Quran, that you may explain clearly to men what is sent down to them, and that they may give thought." Thus, the hadith are a further explanation to the Quran and Islam. So notice, Allah not only sends the Quran, but He sends the Prophet Muhammad to actually explain what is in the Quran. Why does the Prophet have to explain the Quran if the Quran is self-explanatory? This proves it requires an external source. And then Bernie writes back, the Quranist, he writes back, he says, why does the Prophet have to explain the Quran if the Quran is self-explanatory? And he has a big laugh about it. And I said, well, the Quran never claimed it was self-explanatory. It says that Allah sent Muhammad to explain it. The fact that you're laughing in mockery proves you have no truth in seeking knowledge. Can you show us where is the preserved explanation of the Quran that Muhammad came to teach? Additionally, if the Quran is self-explanatory, the Quran says to beat women. How do you accept this moral abuse of women? This proves the Quran requires external interpretation, period. Of course, no Quranist would say that the Quran is Muhammad's words. So if Allah is telling us that He's sending the Prophet Muhammad to explain the Quran, then where is this preservation? Where is this? And that's where the hadith and the tafsir come in. Why? Because those companions have learned from other Sahaba of what they heard the Prophet say concerning particular verses, and that's how we get the explanation and some of the details found in the Quran. Now the Quranist, when completely defeated, he will use a fourth attempt to try and justify what this explanation actually means. So as you can see, he quotes several verses in Surah 55:1 where Allah is a beneficent. Allah taught the Quran in 55:2, and he quotes 75:17 which says, "Surely unto us rests the collection of what reciting of it." Then the Quranist also claims another verse. He says in Surah 75:18, it says, "So when we recite it, it follows its recitation." And then he quotes, look particular to this verse, in Surah 75:19, he quotes, "Again on us rests the explaining of it." So notice the condescending view here. He quotes 75:19 where he says that Allah is the explainer of the Quran, that Allah himself is explaining. So he's not even accepting the Prophet Muhammad's explanation of the Quran. Yet remember earlier, he was giving himself the authority to explain the Quran. Remember he said that sort of 434 interjects the word kick them out of the house or strike them out of the house. So notice he rejects the Prophet Muhammad, yet earlier he accepted him as an explainer of the Quran. And now he's saying that only Allah gets to explain the Quran. However, this is completely condescending. Why? Because Surah 75:19 is in conjunction with Surah 16:44. That when Muhammad explains is as though Allah is explaining through the mouthpiece of the Prophet Muhammad. So we have Allah revealing the Quran and we have the Prophet Muhammad explaining that. Now when the Prophet Muhammad explains the Quran, obviously that's an explanation that Allah agrees with. Thus they are both explaining the Quran. So had the Quran been alone, the Quran should have said, we've sent the Quran and the Quran will explain itself. But it doesn't say that. It says Muhammad, peace be upon him, will explain the Quran. So you see there's a clear distinction between the two. And again, we asked him, how is Surah 434 interpreted? And he can't even interpret it with its true meaning. Otherwise, he has to accept a physical beating, and that would be clearly morally unjustifiable. But a Quranist might interpret it that way if he moves away from the regulations of Hadith. And like I said, I could punch my wife in the face if I read Surah 434 and just say that's how Allah explained it to me in Surah 434. And you can't even dispute it. This is why we say they are blind without the guidance of outside external sources. And I rest my case with that. And the Quranist comes back and he says, honestly, I'm not sure, I'm not a scholar, just a warner. So now, earlier he was acting like a scholar, acting like he could interpret Islam with the Quran only face value. Yet now he's actually distancing himself and saying he's not a scholar and is honestly not sure about the situation. Well, I thank him for his honesty, and I hope he actually thinks about some of the things that he says and he comes back to the true teachings of Islam. He then says, however, he kind of changes his mind. He says, then let my deen be mine and yours be yours. So now he's creating division between the two. You notice? He's now saying, let your deen be yours and mine be mine. And he wants to run now. He wants to move away from the discussion and the debate. And I gave him one more kick in the gut before he left. I said to him, before you go, because he wants to leave now, he wants to leave the discussion. I said, before you go, I said, show me where in the Quran it says it is haram to actually screw a goat, since the Quran is fully detailed and the only source and self-explanation, right? Can he show this? And of course, the Quran doesn't say this specifically, so we go to the Hadith, because the Quran says, yes, it is fully detailed, but it tells us that being fully detailed means to follow the explanation of the Prophet Muhammad. And in the Hadith, the Prophet Muhammad outlines that it is against Islam to have sexual intercourse with animals. This is narrated in Sahih Muslim and Sahih Bukhari. So now the Quranist can't even respond to that. So can he prove that it is haram to screw an animal? He can't. So he actually laughed at the comment, as you can see. That's Bernie. He actually laughed at the comment and he did not respond. So he just basically took off. So there you have it, folks. That is the most easiest and most effective way to debunk a Quranist when he tries to claim that the Quran is the only source. Thank you.